Resident Evil 4 2023? Oh my god. Ayo, stop me if you've heard this one before. Resident Evil 4 back in 2005 was a revolutionary game that popularized the over-the-shoulder perspective and set the standard for action shooters going forward. Thanks to its addicting combat loop, upgrade system, excellent content pacing, and endless replayability with extra content, it's long since solidified itself as one of my favorite games of all time. Very bold and original take, I know. Fast forward several years, we've come to the modern era of Resident Evil with remakes galore. Despite finding a lot of enjoyment and value in the remakes of Resident Evils 2 and 3, I was left feeling burned due to just how flagrant they were when it came to removing content, or gratuitously changing things without need to, especially RE3 Remake. Cutting big features like unique AB scenarios, the zapping system, the live selection, and dynamic elements, on top of several enemy types and locations. With extra salt in the wound when you consider the care RE1 Remake showed its source material way back in 2002. Its content retention remaining unmatched on top of expansions and improvements. I really didn't want any more remakes until Capcom showed more care in retaining the content of the game in question. If they had to remake something next, then Code Veronica was a no-brainer. The next mainline entry releasing directly after RE3, arguably the most flawed of the classic Resi games in its cheap gameplay design and lacking character writing and voice acting. It also being among the most iconic games in the series with its epic character moments, unique locations rendered in-game for the first time, and especially its legendary soundtrack. So needless to say, Code Veronica was ripe to be remade, ironing out its gameplay and story flaws, allowing all of the great stuff it does to be expanded and shine even brighter. So when it was revealed we'd be skipping over this golden opportunity and shooting straight ahead to remaking Resident Evil 4, a game which was already as good as it ever needed to be, you could see how I wouldn't be so enthused. And yet, with the release of each and every trailer, and as we saw more of what they were cooking up, more and more sparks of hope were lit in my jaded heart. That maybe, just maybe,
this time, it can be different.
Skipping over Code Veronica is never gonna be okay, let's just get that straight, but now having several playthroughs of RE4 Remake and 150 hours of playtime under my belt, wow. We do lots of fun things on this channel on top of these game analyses, like big animations, and big mods for the Halo games campaigns. So subscribe and give a like if you're interested, and head over to my Patreon if you'd like to chip in. Let's take a trip back to 2005. Resident Evil 4 was a notable departure from the design of the series up to that point, the first 6 mainline entries all sharing a consistent gameplay and presentation style of tense decision-based combat, resource management, exploration, and puzzle-based progression, all captured through a dynamic camera style that immersed you through putting the daunting locations front and center of focus. By the mid-2000s, after the release of RE0, I'd say they'd made great use of the classic style and had fully exhausted its potential at the time. So the series was well within its right to try something new, and Resident Evil 4 was just the shakeup it needed, perfecting the over-the-shoulder perspective and shifting focus of the game into more arcade-leaning action. Progression now entirely revolved around combat encounters where you're actively encouraged to kill waves of enemies to proceed, and gain loot drops like ammo and money for the newly introduced shop system, where you buy new equipment and upgrade your weapons. The story too followed suit, giving us a fresh start. The endings of 2, 3, and Code Veronica had every character swearing to bring Umbrella down for their crimes, and that's where RE4 picks up. Exploring the aftermath of a post-Raccoon City world, we wipe the slate clean and follow series heartthrob Leon S. Kennedy in a brand new adventure, traveling to a lonely rural Spanish settlement in search of the president's kidnapped daughter. This, along with its new gameplay style, allowed RE4 to be a great jumping on point for new players, while providing existing fans something to chew on through expansions of the lore and moments with the returning cast. Resident Evil 4 is largely regarded as one of the best games ever, and I think that could be attributed to many things, but most key of which being its excellent gameplay design and pacing. Combat being a strategic dance of positioning, weapon choice, and your combination of shooting, melee, and knifing. Every area and combat encounter presenting a unique challenge with a giant variety of enemies and locations on offer. Mix all that together in a pot and you have a masterclass of gameplay-first design. And this is the reason I was so apprehensive about the idea of remaking RE4. In my opinion, the game is already fully realized in its gameplay potential, achieving exactly what it set out to do with flying colors, its legacy speaking for itself. That and, unlike the classic games, RE4 has been excessively well preserved on nearly every gaming platform since the generation it was released. Meanwhile, Code Veronica sits neglected, starving to death, and collecting dust along with the PS1 trilogy, being unavailable on any current platform. But putting that aside for now, how do you even begin to tackle remaking such a hefty piece of gaming history whose gameplay doesn't even stand to benefit much from being recreated from the ground up? The answer to that, I think, is the key to what makes this remake so magical. Like said, Resident Evil 4 was a notable departure from the classics in its gameplay style and tone, so the remake takes this opportunity to bring RE4 back to the classic survival horror roots. A very fitting move too, considering the recent success in reviving the classic gameplay design. The arcadey, fast and loose flow of the original is reworked into slower paced, more methodical combat with a much heightened sense of urgency and danger. In the original, the main enemies, the Ganados, were incredibly predictable and easily exploitable with smart positioning and the right combination of attacks, which is what made them so fun to face and engage in the combat dance against. It's a core pillar so many games follow, the rules of the game being easily readable and gameplay patterns being predictable, encouraging learning and mastering the systems at play to consistently come out on top. And this is why OG RE4 excelled at what I call gameplay first design. Yet in RE4 Make, this dynamic is completely flipped on its head. Ganados are wildly unpredictable in what attacks they'll go for, how they'll move, and how they'll react to being shot. They're significantly faster and more aggressive, often taking multiple shots to even stagger for a melee, meaning it's a lot harder to juggle them around to casually slice and dice. Leon reels and staggers heavily when struck, making taking hits from enemies feel much more intense and punishing. The roster of weapons this time are generally weaker or harder to use at their base stats, featuring slower firing and reloading. It may not seem like it, but these sets of changes fundamentally shift how the core gameplay loop is perceived, which fundamentally shifts how we think about everything in Resident Evil 4. Rather than mastering a tight, predictable dance of combat, the flow of gameplay is flipped to challenge the player on surviving unpredictable and very oppressively punishing foes. It's the distinction of dominating versus overcoming. Something which makes RE4 Make feel decisively more in line with the classic style of survival horror. The increase in urgency and danger is counterbalanced by the change from 3D to 2D controls, standard to modern games, where the direction you push to move is dependent on the camera in relation to the player character. Leon is also now allowed to move while aiming or reloading, but with the trade-off of random bullet spread and longer reload times. In OG, you had to stop to shoot or reload, emphasizing a push and pull of danger and smart positioning to control the flow of crowds, how to get the most out of your selected weapon, and deciding when it's safe to reload. Every move you made was a commitment, made more tense with a limited field of vision. I think the tendency of gamers to write off the OG game's controls and combat design is really silly and narrow-minded. It comes off as weird cognitive dissonance too, when it's because of the way RE4 is designed, not in spite of it, that it's considered one of the best games ever made. In RE4 Make, positioning is still very important, your movement being very slow while aiming, and hindering your bullet spread, but enemies will push your position much more aggressively, given how unpredictable they now are, so you're much more often forced to reposition before getting overwhelmed, and to take greater advantage of the level layouts, giving good purpose to the wider breadth of movement. Being that Resident Evil 4 was already so well realized in its gameplay goals, it was definitely the right call in this instance to make these kinds of shakeups to the core mechanics and gameplay loop, and a very welcome way to bring the feel of combat closer to the series' roots of surviving and overcoming. But what's even more important to a survival horror game like Resident Evil is resource management. It was still a factor to consider in OG, but the focus was more so on how you use the resources in the moment to moment, rather than how you obtain and preserve them. RE4 Make continues to harken back to classic Resi in this regard. You still obtain ammo drops from taking out enemies, but in general there's much less of it to go around. Way more scarce than OG, which gives every strategic combat decision, every bullet fired, more weight. And as with every modern Resident Evil game, and really almost every AAA title nowadays, the game sees a new crafting system, used for making all types of ammo and grenades. But you know what? Unlike other series which shoehorn it in, this system fits Resident Evil like a glove. A series all about scavenging and management of resources. Introduced in OG Resident Evil 3, it's such a great system that adds another layer to that decision making so important to these games. Should you craft handgun and shotgun ammo so you'll have enough to control the oncoming crowd of bad guys? Or expend a bunch of resources to create some much coveted magnum ammo and heavy grenades for that intimidating boss? This new expansion of resources also extends to the knife. In OG RE4, it was a vital piece of the gameplay loop, allowing for free damage on fallen enemies with the risk of getting up close and personal to foes. In the remake, it much retains its role, but with many more added dimensions to its use. Now that enemies have been made more resistant to staggers with heightened aggression, we can now use the knife to deflect oncoming attacks as a skillful defensive tool in your arsenal. But with the right timing, you can perform a perfect parry, opening up foes through a satisfying and cathartic counter melee, giving you a fast way to instantly turn the tables against the hordes surrounding you if you have the reflexes. Depending on how they fall, sometimes you can even follow up with a finishing stab, something incredibly useful for taking a nice chunk of HP out of boss mobs. Falling Ganados now have a chance of erratically spasming in which their plagas will take over, making for an even more dangerous threat. However, if you're quick enough, you can stab them to prevent them from rising back up. Now with the addition of stealth, you can perform silent takedowns on unsuspecting foes, opening up new ways to approach encounters if you're sneaky enough. Although that said, the mechanic can be hit or miss. It's the kind of stealth where the rules are arbitrary and don't make much sense. A single enemy getting aggroed will immediately set off the alarm, even if immediately and quietly dispatched. Yet you can sit a small distance away and headshot enemies with your loud-ass sniper with nary a peep in response. Nonetheless, these additions turn the knife into an extremely valuable tool that can really bail you out of hairy situations, like stopping an enemy's grapple attack or even deflecting Dr. Salvador's chainsaw in a beautiful flurry of sparks and masculine heat. However, all this comes with a price. The knife has been given a limited durability, where it's completely unusable when broken. But as such, we also see added disposable knives found throughout the game, being weaker and breaking faster, but saving you durability on your main knife. These disposable knives can also be used to craft bolts for the bolt thrower, making the whole system interweave into the weapon arsenal nicely. All of this adds a wonderful layer to the resource management loop. The knife in RE4 Make plays an even bigger role than OG due to just how many new options it opens up, especially as now it's something you can upgrade at the merchant, just like your weapons. For another important element, your progression in classic Resident Evil hinged on exploring the map for key items and solving puzzles. Resident Evil 4, while still retaining those elements, shifted its progression to revolve around consecutive combat encounters. This is still true in RE4 Make, but this time around the exploration of the map sees much bigger emphasis, largely thanks to the fleshed out side quest system. In OG RE4, this was only put to use in one place near the start, but now it's been expanded into an entire system spanning the whole game. All throughout, you'll be prompted to complete various objectives that often encourage you to revisit areas, like finding and selling a certain type of item or defeating a uniquely tough enemy. While it would have been nice to have a wider variety of objectives than destroying Blue Medallion several times, this system gets lots of extra use out of these iconic locations. By the same vein, the binoculars of OG, which only saw one use in normal gameplay, now sees lots of use throughout the journey, allowing you to get a sense of the location you're traveling into. It's always nice when remakes expand one-off elements like this. The level design in general has seen a big glow up, often being much more expansive, interwoven with different routes and approaches to encounters. The Lake of the Village and Grand Hall of the Castle being standout examples. The lake was already the most open-ended part of OG, but now it's been blown up into a full-on adventure in search of two objectives, with a metric fuck-ton of side content to find along the way. Midway through the castle in OG, you were presented with two paths to obtain key items to progress. Now that section's equivalent has been expanded to 4 paths, each with their own select items and challenges to consider what to tackle first. RE4 Make takes great pleasure in incentivizing you to backtrack and re-explore older areas, with new key items or with the assistance of Ashley, where you'll often be faced with new enemies spawned in to catch you off guard. This sort of hub-based approach to level design appears in all 3 of the game's major acts, and is undoubtedly when RE4 Make is at its best. This kind of enhancement to the level design is always welcome, being a big focus of the classic games, and my only criticism of it is, I wish they did it even more. On the other hand, let us not overlook the more linear segments of the game that see similar expansions. The best example being Ashley's playable segment, now being expanded into a much more exploratory and very tense affair, suspensefully creeping through these dark, dingy areas while unarmed and running for your life, except now with the new ability to freeze the pursuing armaduras in place with a blue lantern, something which becomes a puzzle piece to the broader lore. Like OG, Ashley can gather loot through smart exploration, which are given to Leon afterwards. Unlike in segments like RE8, where the entire Beneviento segment completely abandoned the core gameplay progression, here you still feel involved in the broader playthrough and gathering valuable treasure. Even more so when afterwards you can revisit this entire area as Leon to deal some sweet cathartic vengeance upon those troublesome knights and engage in content Ashley couldn't access. Again, getting great mileage out of every area. Puzzles too have seen a big glow up compared to OG. RE4 certainly didn't slack on its puzzles on offer, some of them being quite the head scratchers, but nowhere near the complexity seen in 3, Code Veronica, or 0. Well, RE4 makes gotcha covered in that regard. So many of OG's returning puzzles have been cleverly reworked to require much more diligence and thinking, and is a great complement to the exploration and pacing. Through further emphasizing all these elements, the tough strategic combat, the resource management, exploration, and puzzle solving, RE4 Make feels much more in line with the classic design principles of Resident Evil, while still keeping the overall pacing and flow of OG intact. To that end, RE4 Make has a very clever and thoughtful combination of recreating areas nearly one for one, remixing them, and new areas altogether. Certain areas like the village and opening island wharf are nearly shot for shot, looking amazing while expanding on their level design and adding new elements to contend with, like Dr. Salvador ambushing you and cutting off your routes, or the turret lasers which you must reroute to proceed or even use against the mobs. Some of these areas don't even serve the same purpose as OG, like this hideaway in a cave that used to house the merchant, and yet they still painstakingly recreated it to a T, right down to the rifle ammo sitting in the corner. While other areas see remixes that change how you traverse them, such that it creates a unique gameplay experience while simultaneously remaining faithful, something of a running theme with this remake. For example, several locations will have you progress through them backwards, the most obvious being the entire canyon and factory segment, and done with such sensible purpose too. Now that you begin the canyon section in the factory, they take advantage of the more claustrophobic starting section to tutorialize stealth takedowns and the parry system, where you then proceed into the wider valley for the next big horde encounter. There's always this light bulb moment when you suddenly recognize where you are and realize just how faithfully they recreated the location without you even noticing at first. It's pretty magical. And oh boy, RE4 Make is one hell of a cheeky remake. The game takes great pleasure in messing with player expectations the entire runtime. I'm sure all of us took a moment to catch our breaths after that brutal affair that was the new village fight. We enter one of the houses to gather remaining loot and Jesus Christ, what? I thought it was all clear! Okay, just beat that bastard Salazar. My ammo's looking pretty rough. Luckily, the merchant should be right around this corner. Perhaps the most famous example of this is when Capcom crushed everyone's hearts, making us think good old Huey of OG had been cut in the meanest way possible. And by the time you've probably forgotten, there he is.
Take care of yourself, buddy.
Only to then show up in the Elegante fight just as an OG in an even more legendary way. They played us like a damn fiddle and I couldn't be happier.
Thanks, bud.
Many areas are incredibly faithful in how they're rebuilt, but often they'll throw in a new element that drastically shakes up how it plays. Like Ashley now joining you in the Comios-ridden hedge maze, adding a new kind of tension to their ambushes through the bushes. Luis now joins you for the entirety of the mines, further exploring how having a combat-ready partner shakes up the flow of gameplay, as opposed to it being a one-off with the cabin fight, and once again allowing for a fresh experience while simultaneously remaining faithful to OG's gameplay beats almost to a T. A lot of the time, areas or gameplay set pieces will be rearranged or moved to another part of the game for various reasons. And keen-eyed fans of the original will also notice that several locations and encounters end up being merged together. The most notable examples being the Clock Tower, Statue Room, and Spiral Tower of OG, all being merged into one area. The segments of Ashley driving the bulldozer and the wrecking ballroom from the island now take place as Ashley piloting a dragline to destroy a wall, while you fend off the oncoming threats. Had OG RE4 stood to benefit from a more faithful recreation like 2 or 3 did, this kind of merging together and shifting of locations and segments would be a lot less welcome, like fast-tracking moments of the game that should have more space to breathe. But because of RE4 Make's greater emphasis on backtracking, puzzle solving, and much slower gameplay pace in general, I think it works really well and is an incredibly clever way of preserving the original length and sense of pacing through the game's 3 acts. Yet despite that, in my experience, RE4's runtime is even longer than a playthrough of OG, something I hadn't even considered being possible. Every area naturally sees a fresh coat of modern paint, as the game as a whole is visually stunning. They did a fantastic job of adding more contrast and color to the village while maintaining its cold and dilapidated aesthetic. The greater diversity of colors and lighting too greatly benefits the castle and its opulence, particularly in how the rooms are lit much more naturally compared to OG, giving off a more sinister vibe. The island's industrial and creepy look has been superbly recreated, lending the place a big sense of scale it lacked in OG. The greater use of darkness nicely enhances the horror of its interiors and gives off a very oppressive atmosphere. I like how the village plays around much more with time of day, now entering it at the crack of dawn, the sun having risen upon reaching the village. By the time you reach the chief's manor, dusk has set in, casting a deceptively warm color palette over familiar locations. Although that said, I think this change to a warm dusk doesn't work as well for the swamp and lake, where OG made heavy use of fog, overcast clouds, and dirty, dingy colors to set an atmosphere of dread. Visiting these locations now completely lacks that. And as well crafted as the game's visuals are overall, there is a layer of detail OG went the extra mile to include that just isn't present in the remake. Stuff like the realistic and oppressive downpour hitting the nighttime village with stark flashes of lightning that create menacing shadows, the intense puffs emanating from the claustrophobic spaces like the utility tunnels or the boiler room, or the incredible amount of detail in the specimen labs of the island. This is sort of the risk you run when different people work on a remake compared to OG. Certain pieces of detail that might have come about as a result of just one developer's passion can be easily overlooked in the recreation. That said, RE4 Remake is absolutely teeming with attention to detail in its own right in new ways. I'll bet a lot of you will be surprised to learn that there are a few beetles hidden all throughout the remake which can be sold for a high price or consumed to increase your max health. I bet you'll be even more surprised to learn that this is actually a recreation and expansion on an incredibly obscure, small inconsequential detail from OG, where you can find random beetles just hanging out in the environment, where their only interaction is flying away in response to being shot. If this doesn't show just how far the dev team can go with their care and respect for the original, I don't know what does. There's something to be praised about how RE4 Remake manages to strike a perfect balance, making a fresh new experience from start to end, yet through and through still captures nearly everything of what we've come to love about Resident Evil 4, nearly being the kicker here. RE4 Remake unfortunately does fall victim to a few missing areas and encounters. On the whole, it does a significantly better job at retaining the original game's content than 2 and especially 3's remakes. But still, cutting content is perhaps one of the biggest strikes a remake can have against it, so it's important to discuss. Given how much RE4 benefits from this remix-focused approach, I won't count segments that have been moved and repurposed or merged together. More so focusing on content which doesn't have representation or a proper equivalent in the remake. First up, the entire gondola section is missing from the village. Considering this remake's emphasis and expansion of level design in a hub-like fashion, the gondola area could have functioned as the final explorable area for the village, building up to the fight with Mendez. Perhaps it would have bloated the village's length too much from what it is now, but it's a shame the set piece isn't represented nonetheless. The waterfall dam is missing, and although there are many new unique areas in this part of the game, it was still a neat location whose concept isn't represented anywhere. In OG, there was a split path in the village, one leading to a big encounter with the Bella sisters, the other leading to a long stretch where you fight or run from a second Elegante. While both of these areas are still here and the second Elegante is now moved to the castle, that element of deciding which path to take is totally gone, now taking place one after the other, which is a shame. For more minor village cuts, you can no longer shoot the church bell to lure extra ganados to the cemetery, but you can ring it in New Game Plus to end the village fight early, which is a really neat detail, so give and take. The 2 boulder run sections are gone, and if you're gonna say running from boulders has no place in Resident Evil... The truck ambushes at the end of the village, and during the bulldozer section aren't represented in any way, unless you want to count this abandoned truck right before the castle. You can no longer shoot Luis to trigger a special cutscene of him returning the favor to Leon. The castle act made itself notable in how it changed up the tone a lot compared to the village, going from creeping through a decrepit dark village with a fitting horror atmosphere to an opulent palace teeming with wacky contraptions and traps, best shown through the fire dragon chamber, which is completely absent in the remake. Several traps Salazar would spring on the player have also seen the cutting block. This is a shame because the crazy shenanigans of the castle worked as more than just unique set pieces, but as elements that built up Salazar's character as a maniacal sadist. I mean, look at this and tell me this isn't exactly the type of thing Salazar would want in his castle. I respect that this remake is trying to bring the tone more into the rest of the Resident Evil series, but thus far, RE4 Remake has shown how well it can remix these wacky elements to fit more naturally while still giving them fair representation. So if nothing else, it's disappointing that we don't get to see how RE4 Remake could have remixed these locations into something more believable or grounded. Speaking of Salazar, for whatever reason, the scene of Leon taunting Salazar and him sending his right hand to hunt him down has been removed. So now that Verdugo's appearance in the underground tunnel lacks any proper setup. Even stranger, the second Verdugo goes completely missing. In OG, the castle's final boss involves Salazar and the second Verdugo fusing into one giant monster. But the next time you see Salazar in the remake, his left hand is absent entirely with no explanation. The Garrador Cage ambush has been cut, meaning the remake has one less Garrador fight than OG. If they felt it'd impede on the remake's slower pacing and higher difficulty, they could have reworked it into a more unique and creative encounter like they did with the second Elegante. The Novistadors are introduced much later in the game, and as such the sewer prison has now been replaced by the expanded depths below Salazar's throne room. But this section is so linear and simple that it doesn't really feel like an adequate stand-in for the original location. While much of the mines remains intact, we're missing the outdoor ruins and bonfire where the Ganado miners gathered around, which is a shame because it would have been perfect for this remake's new use of stealth. The underground castle ruins that originally led into the minecart ride are absent, though there is a bit greater use of these sorts of ruins on the island, the Staff of Royalty treasure even literally being moved there. And speaking of the island, this Act 2 shook up the tone of RE4 with dark scenes of sadistic science experiments gone wrong, and all-out explosive action. These constant shakeups to the tone and atmosphere, I feel, are another element that contributes greatly to OG RE4's success, keeping the experience and pacing fresh through always giving you something new, and making the game feel like a big adventure. For cut content on the island, the optional radio tower you could visit with an optional cutscene has been cut, which is a shame since it could have further bolstered the island's hub area by giving you more places to explore. The funny little crane game and the garbage disposal and the laser hallway are gone now too. These were incredibly over the top and goofy set pieces, but this remake clearly isn't against having its moments of silly levity. If they were too silly to keep as is, they could have found ways to reference them at the least, or rework them in a creative way, again into something more believable. Perhaps the single biggest removal in this remake is the U3 boss fight, and one that everyone noticed while playing. It was a tense and challenging two-parter of navigating through cargo holds while kiting the beast, and then taking him head-on in an honest, straightforward arena. This remake does a pretty banger job when it comes to handling bosses, so it's disappointing that U3 didn't even get a chance. Notably, however, you can find a file that name drops the U3 as now actually being Salazar's second Verdugo, so this makes me wonder if they're saving the U3 fight and the explanation for where the other Verdugo went for the Separate Ways DLC we know is coming eventually. If so, that would make its removal from the main campaign a lot more understandable. Only time will tell. Lastly, for the island, I want to mention that the ruins you fight Krauser in remains largely intact, but I do wish the area was more open-ended with branching paths. That and the mine robots that ambush you from under the ground have been replaced by mere bear traps, which is kinda lame. To finish off with the cut content are just two weapons. The first being the incendiary grenade, which I just cannot make sense of. In its place, they just made another version of the hand grenade, which is weird. The incendiary in OG was used to disable mobs for a short time while dealing damage to them, and had some really fun utility against select enemies and bosses, dealing extra damage. I can't help but think how they could have been fleshed out in RE4 Make, like creating lingering walls of fire enemies are reluctant to cross, good for area denial and cutting off routes, which could have opened up so many cool strats and a lot of encounters. The second missing weapon is the PRL, which would basically delete every enemy in your field of view, killing their plaga with an intense laser of UV light. I'll let them off the hook for this one though, since the weapon wasn't actually included in the original GameCube release. Same goes for Separate Ways. This stuff wasn't added to OG Resident Evil 4 until the PS2 port, so I think it's a bit unfair to consider them cut content when they were basically incredibly pricey DLC for OG anyway, requiring you to rebuy the full-priced game in an entirely separate console to experience. Assignment Ada though is a different story. Included in the OG release, it was a non-canon arcade-style challenge mode similar to the fourth survivor of RE2. I'm a bit mixed on this missing from the remake. There's an argument to be made that such a small side mode doesn't hold anywhere near as much weight as content from the main part of the game, which in RE4's case is extremely beefy. I consider Mercenaries being the much more important side content to include, which was patched in for free shortly after release. But still, cut content is cut content, so Assignment Ada missing is a mark against the remake nonetheless. It's worth noting that RE4 Make does a better job than recent remakes of replacing cut encounters with new things, but remakes are always at their best when all of OG's substantial content is retained, and new additions are then built on top of that solid foundation, not acting as stand-ins for missing pieces. Even if RE4 Make falls into the same trappings of cutting content from time to time, it must be said that it still goes the extra mile compared to 2 and 3 to reference it in some way. The gondola section may be gone, but you can still see it looming over the village mountains. The lava room of the castle may be missing, but much of its fire-breathing dragon theming has been integrated into the water hall. Although the Garrador cage fight is gone, Leon is still ambushed in a cage trap, now acting as a big plot point in the story. This extra effort to include otherwise missing pieces of RE4 is admirable and shows how thoughtful the devs were with their approach to this remake. Now I'd like to move into more specific elements of the game, starting with the difficulty. Most versions of OG RE4 only had one difficulty starting out. Utilizing and perfecting this system of adaptive difficulty, the game adjusted itself depending on the state of the player, their amount of health, ammo, shots missed, or number of hits taken, ramping up or toning down the enemy aggression, numbers, damage, and loot drops accordingly, ensuring everyone who plays the game can stay in what's been coined as the flow state, of not being too easy, but just challenging enough, doing all of this behind the scenes without the player knowing, which I think is the key to why it works so well. This too, as far as I can tell, is the same in RE4 Make, only now the game comes with more difficulty options from the get-go. Assisted, standard, and hardcore. Noteworthy as hardcore is recommended for people who have played OG RE4, and I can attest that in my onion, hardcore was absolutely perfect for a first playthrough of the remake for an RE4 veteran. Anyone who disagrees is politely invited to get good. And that deserves credit that the remake can offer such a higher level of difficulty, which forces you to relearn the game as if it were completely brand new again. Like in OG, completing the game once unlocks Professional mode, a mode which, as far as I know, simply sets the adaptive difficulty to its max at all times, offering a consistent, high-level challenge for true mastery of the game. On this difficulty, autosaves are disabled, meaning dying will always send you back to your last typewriter save. I'm kinda mixed on this, to be honest. This might be a hot take, but I really think ink ribbons would have made this system a lot more interesting. They would have encouraged committing to your plays and playing past your mistakes, because without any limitations of how many times you can save in a short time frame, you're basically obliged to abuse save scumming between every major fight, which can result in a lot of time wasted regardless of how well you play. Lots of time spent running back and forth from the typewriter. On Professional, the opening village fight is absolutely brutal, and can turn into a toxic mess of relying on good enemy RNG if you're trying to go for the double Dr. Salvador kill, which I have not seen anyone else accomplish, so I'm going to assume that I'm the only person on Earth who's actually done it. But after that, the difficulty levels out, and you're better able to strategize for upcoming encounters in smart and fair ways, especially since on Pro, full upgrades for every weapon are available right from the start, allowing you to prioritize your heavy hitters early on. RE4 Make handles its challenge on offer incredibly well, remaining challenging but fun and fair for the majority of its runtime. However, a couple aspects that never sat right with me, regardless of difficulty, were enemy grabs and staggers. I feel Ganados are simply way too cracked with their grabs, when it's so inconsistent and hard to avoid. Getting grabbed guarantees some health loss even from behind or when you use your knife, and it's insane how a Ganado can just grab you immediately after delivering a hit. It's to the point where you legitimately have to consider unarmed Ganados the most dangerous threats in the room due to how much they magnetize to you. At least you can deflect and parry weapons. It can be especially frustrating early on in the game where your ability to stagger enemies is so unreliable. I can definitely get behind asking the player to put more work into staggering enemies into a melee for this remake and its greater focus on suspense and unpredictability, but having the enemy stagger system so extremely dependent on RNG is going way overboard. There simply is no worse feeling than a Ganado tanking 5 rounds to the face only to grab you and force you to lose health just because you got unlucky with stagger and RNG. It really should have been that even if you have a weak handgun, enemies will always stagger in a maximum of 3 hits to the head in quick succession. Any more than that just feels unfair and wrong. It can feel especially frustrating when so many mundane actions from the enemies can instantly send Leon into a stagger. There's this raw feeling of indignation deep in me when I'm putting so much work and focus into trying to stagger merely one enemy, but all it takes for them to instantly send Leon fumbling around like a clumsy buffoon is jumping through a window, shoving me, or merely walking into me. Likewise, I feel a misused mechanic here is the suplex. It's actually now usable on villagers when knee staggered and triggered from behind, being cathartic and crunchy as hell, even more than OG in my onion, but it's incredibly lame how it can no longer prevent the enemy's plaga from emerging. For how risky and difficult the suplex is to set up, it really doesn't feel worth going for outside of flexing on enemies, which is admittedly tempting. While we're talking about difficulty, I want to bring up the infamous yellow paint. Game developers have really gone out of their way to signpost game mechanics between 2005 and 2023, now that almost every interactable element in RE4 is totally slathered in yellow paint or tape. It isn't really an issue, but I do wish they mix it up a lot more often, since the solution of just throw yellow paint on it gets pretty monotonous. What I do have an issue with though is when we start literally smearing walls with yellow paint to give away the location of an asset you need to shoot to proceed. At that point, we've shot past signposting to straight up giving you the answer to a problem. No need to actually think for yourself. While RE4 switches its control scheme from 3D to 2D, I find it interesting that they decided to give Leon's controls a ton of weight and inertia, even more so than 2 and 3's remakes. It can feel kind of wonky at first, but it's easy to get used to. And something I feel like is the devs' efforts to channel the more limited control scheme of OG by making Leon feel more weighty. But there is an argument to be made that these controls can feel needlessly over-designed. Because Leon takes such heavy transitions to sharp turns, this can result in him not doing what he's told in the middle of a frantic combat situation, like failing to turn to jump off a ledge fast enough before hit, or conversely yeeting himself off when you didn't want him to, thanks to interactions like these not requiring a button prompt anymore, which is pretty unnecessary and annoying. I can't tell you how many times I go for a silent takedown or to stab a transforming enemy on the ground, only to have Leon swing his knife like an idiot, completely missing the prompt trigger, something which is never an issue for melee prompts. There are times when I'll see an attack coming and get the parry timing perfect, only for Leon to not have to turn to face in the right direction in time. And then other times when Leon has to put his knife away first before I can start aiming, resulting in me taking needless damage. I can appreciate the extreme care and polish put into movement mechanics and animations to make them feel weighty and more visceral, but we might be approaching a level where these extra layers of fluff do actively disrupt gameplay from time to time, resulting in the character feeling less responsive than they should be. RE4 sees lots of modern gaming conventions like this, and while most of them are welcome or tolerable, one thing I absolutely cannot stand is inane character dialogue during gameplay. I'm not against it flat out. Dialogue that allow the characters to banter and build personality is always welcome in moderation.
Hey, Leon, there's some armor. Bet you could use it like a bulletproof vest.
Little old-fashioned for my taste.
Too bad. I think you'd look pretty dashing.
But there is nothing that kills the tension in a horror game more than your player character talking to themselves every single time something remotely abnormal happens.
What was that? What's that noise? Oh, great.
It's this constant reminder that these events are not happening to you, but to the person you're playing as. A lot of the horror is just dead on arrival when your player character is basically signaling through their dialogue, "Yep, this is the scary part," Ooh, which eliminates any sense of ambiguity or fear of the unknown, elements invaluable to building horror. RE4 does a lot to boost the horror and tension from the original game every chance it gets, so it's frustrating that effort is undermined at every turn through Leon spouting some superfluous bullshit.
What the fuck are you?
This kind of pointless dialogue is an underrated problem with modern Resident Evil games at large though, and I swear if I have to hear a Resi character say, "You gotta be kidding me" one more fucking time.
Are you kidding me? You gotta be kidding me.
You gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me. Are you fucking kidding me? Fucking kidding me? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You fucking kidding me? You kidding me?
Are you shitting me? You're kidding me.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me. Oh, you're kidding me.
You gotta be kidding me.
Oh, you're kidding me.
That, and you also have the issue of characters blatantly stating the obvious for no reason, like so many modern games do.
Some kind of shrine.
Is that a clock? A hidden staircase? Keys.
Same mark from the church. It's the lake. And there's a symbol on the wall. There's a symbol on the wall.
It's just so unnecessary and feels condescending that the game isn't even giving you an opportunity to connect the dots yourself. Thankfully, this pointless dialogue almost never appears at the actual puzzles, but still it's something RE4 would feel a lot more gratifying and suspenseful to play without. What I do like though is the addition of dynamic combat related quips, like when Leon performs a melee, throws a grenade, or he and Ashley comment on the battle they just finished. This kind of stuff feels a lot more natural and welcome, but that said, there are far too few variations of these lines for how frequently they play.
Sorry.
More variations should have been recorded and a system in place better to reduce repetition. While we're on the subject of my biggest criticisms, that brings us to Ashley. It's kinda crazy to think that RE4, considered by many one of the greatest games ever made, has an escort mission taking up half the game. That's a testament then to how well it was handled. She's treated much more like a chess piece in OG than a dynamic NPC. She had a binary state of follow or wait. Following, she'd stick right up against you. While waiting, she'd freeze in place, always ducking down to clear your line of fire. Because you had such a clear degree of binary control over her, it made sections with her a challenging but very fair game of managing her position in relation to you and the enemies. RE4 retains Ashley in prominence as an escort character, but with big changes. Now you can only tell her to stick close or lag behind. In concept, the tight formation is used to keep her close when running through mobs of bad guys, and loose formation is used to give you space in combat where she'll keep her distance from danger. But in practice, the system is very messy, and what I consider a linear downgrade from OG. While the system isn't outright broken, there are far too many times where I tell Ashley to stick close, and yet she's lagging a mile behind or doing nothing in a crowd of enemies. Or I tell her to stay back and she's constantly running right in front of me or freezing behind me like a statue.
Stay back!
Okay.
RE4 removes Ashley's health bar, now merely being incapacitated until you get her back up. Any further hits taking killing her. But where in the original there were harsher consequences to badly managing Ashley, her losing health, you had full control over her behavior and position. So anytime she was hit or grabbed, it was your fault. Here though, that lack of control over her means her safety is largely now in the hands of the AI, so all removing player control and consequences for poor management does is transform her from a key part to mastering the game into an incidental annoyance you just have to deal with every now and then.
Die, stubborn son of a bitch. Ashley!
In OG, there were also sections where you had the choice of Leon or Ashley performing an action. Being faster to complete as Leon, but getting Ashley to do it will allow you to fend off any incoming danger. All of these points in question have been removed, which is a shame. Now anytime you can tell Ashley to do something, it's the only way to actually progress. All this said, there are a couple nice shakeups in the ways Ashley can help you here and there. The Armadura room now sees her tossing blue lanterns onto the knights, something which you can utilize in fun ways to line them up for a melee, exposing all their plaga at once. If you're not bothered about losing out on the loot, you can have her dump that pesky Iron Maiden chasing you in the garbage disposal straight into a pit. Clean and easy.
How do you like this?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
There are a lot more points in the remake where you can revisit locations to access locked away goodies with Ashley's help, and Ashley has a lot of new little details that help make her genuinely likable. Like OG, she'll still pump her fist in response to headshots, but she can also compliment you on well-placed sniper shots, and will warn of enemies attempting to sneak up on you. Some really nice dynamic combat dialogue has been added too. Ashley and Leon can have brief back and forths that change depending on how much you struggled in a fight. She'll get super worried about you if you play recklessly and take a lot of damage. She'll even comment on a piece of treasure you can find, looking forward to seeing how much it's worth at the merchant. These little moments where the player and character's interests align in a gameplay sense can do a ton when it comes to making them more likable. It's the same reason the merchant is so fondly remembered. After seeing RE2 and Remake completely waste the potential of their OG's enemy rosters, I am so refreshed to see that every non-boss enemy from OG RE4 returns with fun new twists. So let's go into them all and explore the changes made. For the basic enemy in the Ganados, it's really clever how they're now able to transform during the day, except their plaga won't actually emerge. Rather, they'll go into a more dangerous hyper mode where they're extra grabby, and the remake uses this to subvert expectations in fun ways early on. I like how once you reach the castle, the regular mobs can spin around when staggered from knee shots, and allowing for an easier time triggering a suplex, a clever reference to how the suplex only became available for use at the same point in the game. I'm glad they fixed the janky hitboxes on the island turrets and made taking out their gunners a less frustrating affair. Even cooler how you're actually able to man the guns now to take out several targets in no time, as long as you don't waste unlimited ammo. I really like how they've handled the 3 plaga types that can emerge from the Ganados. The first variant being the same as ever, having a wide radius it can slice at you with its tentacles, except now parryable. But the Wormhead variant now allows its host to swing around on the ceiling, as well as being tanky as hell if you don't shoot it straight in the mouth, so it adds even more tension to its insta-kill decapitation and how much you have to wait for your chance to deliver your shots. The Spider plaga still move around on their own, only now they're able to crawl across the walls and will lash themselves onto other Ganados to take control of them, sending them barreling towards you in a frenzy. Dr. Salvador and the Bella sisters have been wonderfully recreated, those bloodshot eyes sticking out of Sally's sack being super creepy. They no longer let you easily juggle them on the floor anymore, being much more resistant to your melees. They have a lot more attack patterns this time around, so there's much more importance to reading their tells to know how to react. Something really interesting is how the cow and boar-headed brute Ganados at first seem like a totally new enemy, but in reality, the brute is a redesign of the hammer-wielding armored soldiers from the island section, now having an extra unarmed WrestleMania-ass variant that gives precisely 0 solitary fucks. I found the brute to be a fantastic addition to the village too, subverting your expectations as you weren't expecting to have to face another tough boss mob so soon after the opening village fight. The brute now takes the role of the Gatling gun wielding JJ from OG. I think this redesign was a good call, it fitting much more thematically with the other enemies and locations. The JJ this time around firing flaming arrows which, if you didn't know, can actually be rapid fire parried. Absolute insanity. The Red Robe Zealot have been repurposed from simply tougher variants of the cultists to key threats that can stun you and summon Plaga from their underlings. So their encounters now become a challenge of managing the mooks to quickly take out their leader, preventing the extra trouble. The Comillos are introduced much earlier, now surprising you on your second visit to the village. They're just the same as OG, being fast enemies that test your aiming reflexes, them being even more dangerous if you allow their tentacle whipping Plaga to emerge. And introducing a brand new type of threat, farm animals. No, seriously, the cows, pigs, and chickens this time around have absolutely no chill.
Ashley!
The Garrador is much the same to fight as OG, only now his arenas are much more claustrophobic to traverse, where dangling chains threaten to alert him, and partitions threaten to get yourself cornered. The double Garrador fight was one of the hardest parts of OG, and it's even more so now. The room flooding noisy cultists in that really pile on the pressure, constantly alerting the Garradors to your location. The Novistadors still appear in large swarms and use camouflage to ambush you, now lying in wait for you to come near. But surprisingly, there are much more pushovers in the remake, having so little health that all it takes is a few handgun shots to kill one. In the late game, they have you literally swarmed on all sides by them, so their low HP definitely helps to keep things fair. The Armadura were perhaps one of the toughest enemies in RE4, being very tough and relentless bullet sponges if you didn't quickly reveal their parasites and clean house with a flashbang. Here, although they're easier to dispatch, I'd say they're more interesting to fight, now needing to shoot their exposed parasite, parry them, or wait for Ashley to line them up for a melee stagger, in which their Plaga will be revealed to dispatch as an OG. The Regenerators, or as the game now calls them, the Regenerators, were handled masterfully. Their introduction now builds even more suspense as you can hear their creepy breathing in the distance. Their section is now more of a twisting labyrinth you can easily lose yourself in, as you must transfer power back and forth to access areas while being pursued by these pale monstrosities. They are much more aggressive in chasing you down as you run away, making hitting the parasites inside them all the more challenging as you fight to maintain your aim and distance. In a cheeky, clever move by the devs, they actually hit a key item inside one of the Regenerators, which you must kill to obtain. Another really clever change is certain Regenerators, thinking you've killed them, will morph into the Iron Maiden of OG, now capable of shooting needles out of its body to hit you from range. And these guys are no joke, calling on you to deliver several powerful shots to their head before falling, made all more difficult with their erratic sways and newfound rage. All throughout the game, there are many side quests that will task you on killing a beefed up version of a common enemy. These are all really fun and challenging, and a great way to get extra mileage out of the enemy roster. OG RE4 had a slew of the best boss fights the series had to offer, and the remake goes great lengths to remix or add new dimensions to many of these fights. Delgado is surprisingly faithful, when I was expecting it to be the most overhauled, but I'm not complaining. The bow controls this time around aren't quite as polished or weighty feeling, although the heavily physics-based bow controls of OG did lead to a lot of unfair damage and being unable to steer out of the way of danger in time. The Delgado is generally much easier in the remake, although the number of harpoons needed to kill is much higher, so it does tend to drag on a bit. But I like how the lower its health gets, the more desperate and aggressive its movements become, giving the fight a ramping sense of intensity. The new Delgado fight actually introduces the gameplay concept of vehicle health, something which will be used later in the game for various returning sections, like the minecart ride and wrecking ball encounters. It makes for a nice, consistent mechanical through line that spans the entire game. Although speaking of the minecart section, I wish you still used your own weapons and resources to fend off threats, rather than being given a magical infinite red 9. It's a bit too inconsequentially set-piecey now for my liking, nothing you do here having any impact on your gameplay afterwards. Elegante, I think, is what everyone considers the true first boss, properly testing you on your weapon usage and positioning. It's just as much of a banger as OG, right down to Huey coming to save the day, although it must be said just how cracked Elegante is this time around, utterly ruthless in his attacks, to the point where I genuinely have no clue how you're meant to avoid damage at points. There's more variety integrated into the fight, whereby the second half is Plaga remains visible at all times, making things more tense and trying to place precise shots on a towering, constantly moving threat. The second Elegante fight at the latter half of the village has been moved to midway through the castle, in an entirely unique segment about dodging the rocks he throws, no doubt inspired by a certain anime, while dealing with cultists getting in your way, ending off with using a cannon to put an end to his rampage. I do wish though that there was a short second phase where you finish him off in a proper one-on-one gameplay segment, as ending the whole thing off with a cutscene of him failing to grab Leon and falling into the void is very anticlimactic. The third and final showdown had you versus two Elegante at once, probably the single hardest encounter in OG, if you forego dropping them into the lava in order to get both their loot. This fight now sees Luis assisting you, drawing one of them away. Now you must down the giants to dunk them into the lava, lest they simply move out of the way. You won't be able to deal damage to the armored one until Luis straps some dynamite to its back to expose its plaga. It's definitely more set-piecey and less difficult than OG, but I still like it, especially in how it gives Luis time to shine. The Chief Mendez fight is good, but a bit of a step down from OG. The level design here is way more simplistic, giving you a ton of space to distance yourself from him, so the intensity of keeping track of him in a more three-dimensional layout of OG's Burning Barn is gone. Otherwise, it's still the same two-phase fight of OG with the big cheese of the village, only now you can hit a weak spot on his back for extra damage if you have the firepower. Verdugo was one hell of a fight in OG, and in RE4 Make he's just as nimble, fast, and intimidating. Your only feasible means of damaging him involve luring him into traps of nitrogen, and unloading before he shakes free. Only this time around he's a bit smarter and knows better than to carelessly wander into traps you've preemptively set off. The parry becomes particularly important in this fight, with how much he loves slicing at you from afar with his tail. The Salazar boss has seen a total redesign from top to bottom, and it feels like they've shifted the style of the fight between Mendez and Salazar. Mendez now being the slower target you shoot from a distance, with Salazar being the agile threat coming at you from all angles. Where in OG, he and his second Verdugo morphed into a giant monster mounted on the wall, with large tentacles smashing down at you, now he's a nimble beast with a big gaping maw, capable of spewing black liquid from range and laying traps of toxic blobs around the arena. For me, this was definitely the toughest boss in RE4 Make, perhaps the biggest test of managing your position in relation to the boss, and very difficult to rack up decent damage with how much he swings around in all directions. Something hilarious though is that Salazar loses a whopping 70% of his health to a single golden egg thrown at him. So if you struggled a lot with this boss, keep in mind the power of the Yolk to deliver a quick, humiliating defeat to our dear regal Castellan. The Krauser fights, I'd say, are an all-in-all improvement from OG. In your first encounter with him, rather taking place entirely through cutscene QTEs, the new knife and parry system is put to excellent use as you play all of that out yourself in real gameplay, a change I'm all for. When facing him down for the last time in his extended game of cat and mouse, Krauser is much better to fight in the remake than OG, where before it was all but a complete waste of ammo to use your guns on him, as the knife had a gigantic damage multiplier applied here, capable of killing him in around a dozen slices. No doubt this was done to incentivize players to get in on the knife fight action, like the famous QTE cutscene seen before, but otherwise there's nothing that tells the player any of this, so all it results in is needless wasting of precious ammo. In RE4 Make, these discrepancies in damage are leveled out to make way more sense. Now you can trust that your weapons will actually put in the work to win you the fight. The knife is still very important, however. The entire affair calls on you to have mastered the parry system in order to properly deal with Krauser's ambushes and relentless offense. And lastly, the final boss Sadler sees a big and welcome expansion to his fight, while remaining fundamentally the exact same, hitting him with heavy explosives or shooting the eyes on his legs to expose his weak point. The arena has been massively scaled up and expanded to account for his bigger size, and the addition of Novicidors to swarm and overwhelm you, making the whole thing incredibly hectic and desperate, befitting of RE4's final boss. Sadler 2 makes great use of the expanded area, being much more mobile and leaping around, and even taking out certain pathways to limit your options as the fight goes on. All ending in Ada once again tossing you that special rocket launcher to deliver that final, decisive blow to his core.
I'll give you a holy body.
Overall, despite cutting the Garrador fight and the U3, RE4 Make does a wonderful job retaining and expanding on OG's huge roster of enemies and bosses, and they all show just how magical remakes can be when you have the imagination and creativity to expand and improve on the content on offer, big or small. On the other hand though, one thing the developers have made a point to do away with, supposedly, are QuickTime events. All of the cutscene QTEs which would pop up to avoid Leon being killed have been removed. Their reasoning being QTEs are not seen as fashionable today, but honestly I find that reasoning pretty dubious at best. Because despite what people might claim, this game is still packed to the brim with quicktime events. Several enemies, and especially bosses, make heavy use of a sudden prompt appearing to perform a non-standard gameplay action, usually in the form of Leon performing sick flips. Hell, the entire parry system could be considered a QuickTime event, hitting a button prompt at the right timing to perform an action you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And let me remind you, the parry system is no small addition to this remake. In the Delgado boss fight, they removed the QTEs involving swimming back to the boat when you've been thrown out, yet they added in an all-new one of stabbing Delgado in the mouth if you've been trapped. So their stance on QTEs comes off as really contradictory. Like in their mind, QTEs are poor taste nowadays, so their first instinct is to remove as many of the existing ones as possible, but then they also recognize that it's a genuinely useful mechanic to perform game actions unique to certain encounters, so then they add in entirely new ones where there weren't before. Only difference is, they don't call the new ones QTEs? Yeah, okay guys. Honestly, how different is constantly mashing the X button to escape this remake's extremely clinging enemies versus mashing X to escape a boulder a couple of times? QTEs on their own are a perfectly fine and valid addition to your game. It only becomes a problem like in RE6 and RE3 Remake, where they're used as a crutch to make up for the lack of substantial gameplay. Something we can all agree is not a problem with either version of RE4. And there is something to be said that, QTEs or not, it's a shame to lose a lot of Leon's most iconic scenes, showing his capability and quick thinking in these life or death situations. The alternative to these scenes now just being getting out of it through sheer dumb luck. With that, let's dive into another element that contributed to making RE4 such an incredible and captivating experience. You can't talk about a landmark third-person shooter without talking about the pool of weapons. Much of the core gameplay appeal in RE4 comes from the progression loop, and how you build a well-rounded arsenal and upgrade it throughout the game in preparation for the challenges you'll face. Every weapon in RE4 reshapes how you fight the enemies, and all fulfill an important role in every encounter. Your bread and butter handgun lining up enemies for a good old melee and knife combo, the shotguns blowing off heads and controlling crowds, the snipers swiftly taking out the biggest threats, the TMP keeping fast enemies at bay, and of course the Magnum in all its anti-boss powerhouse glory. There are several specialized tools like the grenades and mine thrower which open up creative tactics in every part of the game, as well as a free rocket launcher midway through which presents a big choice of what boss you should save it for. Starting up New Game Plus, you gain access to a boatload of extremely overpowered weapons like the Infinite Rocket Launcher and Chicago Typewriter, which completely trounce every enemy in the game if you can work up enough money to buy them. So, how does RE4 Remake handle this giant armory of fun? Well, I'm so happy to say that every weapon other than the PRL and Incendiary returns in full form with new twists on their function and upgradability. And at that, the remake sees several expansions to the roster of weapons that makes them all more unique from one another with distinct strengths. The Bolt Thrower is a 2-in-1 package, acting as both a new weapon and an expansion on the Mine Thrower. The bolts it fires able to be retrieved after use, and have the highest stagger chance on enemies, making it an excellent tool for saving ammo between big major fights. But for those major fights, you can attach explosive mines to the bolts and spend them to wreak havoc on crowds and bosses. The Matilda is now available on a new game, which is a very welcome shakeup. Its stock enabling the 3-round fire coming separately from it this time around. And we also see the addition of 2 new weapons, an SMG and an assault rifle. These new rapid fire options are amazing additions to the roster that open up new interesting combinations of guns, now having more options for your high DPS dealer which use a wider diversity of ammo types. All of the rifles now, by default, aim down their sights to fire, but they, and both of these new weapons, can be attached with a selection of scopes. I don't know why you would ever want to fire an MP5 through a high-powered hunting scope, but that's what makes it fun. Aside from the shotgun, RE4 Remake changes the selection of weapons you can find, a welcome remix that shakes up RE4's weapon progression. And upon defeating Krauser, you can now obtain his huge, badass knife, being significantly more powerful, but a slower alternative to your base knife. It's just a shame it's obtained so late in the game, and is the only alternative available on a new game to your starting knife, not counting the disposables. The starting knife this time around actually takes the appearance of the one used in RE2 Remake, which is some nice continuity, but can't go without saying just how fugly it is compared to OG Leon's sleek, licensed to kill looking blade. But thankfully that same knife of OG can be unlocked, looking just the same as ever, and while not as fast as your base knife, can be upgraded to have infinite use, something of a godsend on New Game Plus. Because your base weapons in the remake are much harder to use than OG against more aggressive mobs of foes, it makes it all the more cathartic by the late game and especially New Game Plus, once you've upgraded your equipment to be fast, powerful, and reliable to use. Nothing quite beats the feeling of returning to the village that gave you so much grief before, now ready to bring a world of pain to all those sorry-ass grandmas and grandpas. It's this dynamic that I feel gives RE4's gradual gameplay progression in New Game Plus so much oomph compared to other action or shooting games. All this said, I do have a couple gripes for a few things regarding your weapons. I found the arc Leon would throw grenades to be inconsistent and utterly idiotic in a few instances, as opposed to the consistent throwing arcs of OG. Like mentioned, the aiming system has been overhauled from OG, every weapon before aiming with a laser sight, but RE4 make using the more widely adopted crosshair system, meaning every weapon has a degree of random spread. This is fine in most instances, but there is a fundamental issue with things. RE2 and 3 make had the crosshair tighten when not moving, encouraging committing to a position for higher damage, bringing the gameplay flow nicely in line with the classic combat, whose focus was all about smart positioning. On paper, RE4 make retains this system, but the balancing is all off. The reticle takes so much longer to focus than the last two games, now moving your aim at all completely resets it. And in a much faster paced game than 2 and 3 make, this renders the entire reticle focus system completely dysfunctional. There is no situation in this game where you want to completely freeze all of your movement and aiming to focus your crosshair. Not only is there no reliable difference in how enemies react, but the game will simply never allow you to freeze in place like this due to how frantic things get from the mob swarming you. Safe to say, I have no idea what they were thinking with this balance change. In a very tasteful and clever twist, the laser sight still exists and has been reworked into an attachment that you can buy that will fit on the starting handgun or the Punisher. The Killer 7 Magnum 2 naturally comes with a laser sight, using the one mounted on top of it as always, making it more distinct from the Broken Butterfly than OG in its accuracy and critical hits. So although the aiming system has changed to something more akin to modern shooters, it's really nice that they use this to their advantage to repurpose the laser into something that gives weapons more distinct roles. Despite a few gripes, RE4 Make overall does good justice to the weapon roster, especially appreciated in now how we're able to assign weapons to the D-pad and swap on the fly. I'm definitely not gonna miss pausing the game on every weapon swap. And speaking of, the famous attaché case returns in all its glory, where you sort all your items to your liking to make for an efficient and tidy armory in your back pocket. It was always so satisfying to sort everything into place in OG, and it's much the same in the remake. However, one thing that sort of undermines it all is the addition of an auto sort button, where the game will automatically clump your inventory together to make as much space as possible. No doubt, it was added as a quality of life feature, but I think doing so misses the point of OG's attaché case. You were going to spend a lot of time with your inventory, so making your most frequently used equipment easily accessible and making space for all the valuable items you would find was of big importance, working as sort of a game-wide puzzle. With auto sort, however, you're essentially giving players a button to skip engaging in that puzzle, and in doing so, players who use this are going to have less of an attachment to their inventory than OG, and as a result, the entire attaché case system risks losing out on the impact that made it so beloved to begin with. Not to mention the utterly soul-crushing feeling of accidentally hitting the auto sort button, as I have several times, turning my carefully organized inventory into a shameful mess. We've gone into many facets of RE4 Make so far, praise and criticism aplenty, but one element we can all agree Capcom nailed perfectly is the universally beloved, enigmatic, shrouded star that is the Merchant.
Welcome.
Where to start? He's the heart and soul of Resident Evil 4's economy. The entire systems of treasure and weapon progression all revolving around him, visiting him countless times throughout your journey to buy new equipment, sell valuable items or disused weapons, and tune up your gear. So much of Resident Evil 4's addicting and timeless gameplay pacing can be credited to the Merchant. Despite having literally no backstory to be explored, never seeing his face, and never appearing in the series since, he's one of the most beloved characters in gaming history. The Merchant in RE4 Make is a perfect showcase of exactly how you improve, expand, and preserve the content of the source material. Every core system of the Merchant remains intact, with loads of added elements and depth that take the whole thing to the next level. Throughout the game, various items on sale will be given limited time discounts, which makes for a fun decision of perhaps holding out on a certain weapon attachment or case upgrade to see if it goes on sale. The body armor you could buy in OG returns, now much earlier in the game, and totally soaking up explosive damage, but with limited durability that can be repaired for a fee, like your knife. This seems like a small change, but I think it's another case of how gameplay systems can interweave in a great way. If you're too reckless, the body armor could end up becoming a big money sink that could lose you out on helpful weapon upgrades. So so it effectively becomes an element of further encouraging playing smart, so as not to waste money on constant repairs. The bulk of your pesetas will always come from a huge amount of treasures collected throughout the world. OG had a giant assortment of shiny, opulent, and interesting cultural icons you could discover that could be sold at the merchant for a hefty sum. Virtually all of these treasures have been faithfully and beautifully recreated in the remake, and a great example of how sometimes recreating elements one-to-one is absolutely the right call to make. There's been a clever remix of the more generic treasures you can find throughout the game. In OG, spinels were a game-wide collectible that could be sold for cash. The castle introduced the Velvet Blue as its primary collectible, with the island then introducing the Emerald. All three of these gemstones have been repurposed. The Velvet Blue now takes the spinel's role as the generic game-wide collectible, with the spinel now being found as rare random drops and being acquired by completing side quests, now functioning as its own currency for an entirely secondary shop the merchant has on offer. In this secondary shop, you can purchase a bunch more unique items only available here, like maps marking treasure, the weapon stocks, attaché case skins that provide various modifiers, and insertable treasure and gemstones. The last of which is what the Emerald has been reworked toward, and one of my favorite expansions RE4 brings to the table. OG RE4 had a neat system where certain treasures you found could be inlaid with compatible gemstones. Their value going up the more complete it became. RE4 takes this idea and runs with it, expanding it into a game of gathering a variety of gemstones to be used in any of the upgradable treasures you can find. All about choosing the right combinations of gems to get the most value out of that treasure. It becomes a fun game of weighing your options, balancing using your highest value rarest gems to get the biggest lump of pesetas in the short term, or holding out for colors that can net you the highest combo bonus for more money in the long term. While it is a bit of a shame to lose out on the more unique gemstone pieces like the cat's eyes or the ancient stones, this system is simply genius and expands something that was already great into an in-depth game-wide puzzle. And of course, you're encouraged to kill high priority enemies like boss mobs or full-on bosses, since they'll often drop valuable gemstones. So what we have is a beautiful system that complements and interweaves with every other mechanic to take Resident Evil 4's gameplay progression to the next level. I simply cannot say enough good things about the Merchant in RE4 It's peak game design through and through, and the go-to examples of how you expand on interweaving gameplay systems in a remake to strengthen the game as a whole. It said he's perhaps too chatty during your interactions, and I agree, but honestly that's something I feel only builds his character even further. He's a smarmy, opportunistic shopkeeper keen on buttering up his customers and polishing their egos to make them feel greater validation for their purchases, and thus more money for him.
Crossing your T's, dotting your I's, that's the way to be.
What I find really funny to consider is, Capcom had every opportunity to integrate the Merchant more into the story, explore his backstory, develop his character, and all that. So it feels like such a flex that they didn't do any of that, because they understood the Merchant doesn't need any of that to be a memorable and legendary character. He rides entirely off of his utility to gameplay. Another system connected to the Merchant we can't go without mentioning is target practice. At certain points in OG, you'd be able to partake in silly little shooting galleries, going for the highest score and hitting all of the right targets in the limited time they appeared. In a wonderful stroke of care and attention, the shooting range has been overhauled into something even more memorable and off the wall. The entire minigame has taken on a wacky pirate theme, and there are a much wider selection of games to play that make great use of many more of the weapons and their unique roles. Meeting each game's completion conditions will enter you into a brand new bonus time, and this is where things get totally bonkers. Ashley and Louise, who can accompany you, get hyped up as several bonus targets flood the field, all while an energetic rendition of the original game's opening music plays on full blast. It's such a random tonal departure from every other part of the game, in a way where you can't help but love it. Your performance in each game is ranked on several factors, one of which being the skull targets that will appear throughout, and this is where things get really sweaty. We've gotten into the new aiming system before and how the random spread isn't really a problem in normal gameplay. Here though, where your rank hinges on nigh perfect performance, the spread turns several of the games into an utter shit show of grinding out RNG. You will not understand pain until you have tried for a perfect score and all rewards on the games involving the TMP. And this is with me switching to the mouse and keyboard purely for these challenges. So suffice to say, as long as you don't torture yourself with going for every reward, the shooting range is just plain fun and a great expansion on what came before. In OG, your rewards for the shooting range were an increasingly big chunk of pesetas and bottle caps with models of the game's characters.
Leon, now!
Something interesting is the bottle cap theme in RE4 has been adapted to the model viewer instead, right down to the little voice lines.
You don't seem surprised.
In its place, the Remake's shooting range now rewards you with silver and gold tokens, used at a nearby machine where the more gold tokens inserted, the higher your chance of getting a rare reward. The rewards in question being charms that can be put onto your attaché case. All of them using the original models for all the characters and enemies, which is a nice touch. Every charm comes with a gameplay modifier of a wide variety, like increasing the chance of bonus ammo when crafting, increasing the health gain from various healing items, discounts for certain things bought from the merchant, and much more. This is such a neat little system that might seem small at first, but I think encourages playing the game differently on subsequent playthroughs. The charms you'll randomly get will often push you into different playstyles to make the most of it. So it's just another element that synergizes with RE4's many other mechanics. An especially nice touch is the rarest of them all, the Striker Charm, a nod to the most famous glitch of the original game, where aiming the Striker then immediately swapping to another weapon will increase the speed of all Leon's animations, allowing you to zip by enemies at lightning speed. The Striker Charm here flat increases your movement speed by 8%, so needless to say, it's an invaluable charm to have. If you're able to get this during a playthrough at all, consider yourself very lucky. The system of modifying your attaché case and attaching charms to get different bonuses is such a smart and fun addition, but I do have a potential very serious problem to bring up with it. If you bought just the base game, you only have 2 other attaché cases available. With so few options, the system for modifying your case seems really half-baked and limited. That is until you realize the Day 1 DLC adds 2 additional cases, which seriously feel like they should have been included in the base game. So it seems most likely they literally cut this content out to sell back to us, which is totally unacceptable and reprehensible. It was bad enough that they charge extra for the ability to switch to the OG soundtracks in these remakes, but to have the gall to do something like this is a new low. This cutting out of content to sell back to us also extends to the DLC weapons and costumes. Sure, the bonus DLC content is an infinitesimally small part of this huge, beefy game, but if we don't call out garbage like this, who's to say it won't get even worse, cutting out even larger portions of the game to sell back to us? On a more lighthearted note, since we're talking about side content, now's a good time to bring up the little collectibles you could get. I really like how, starting with 7, every RE Engine game has its own cheeky little collectible, having their own sound cues. RE4 continues this trend, this time taking the form of the tiny little Salazar figure, referencing the giant statue of OG in its pose. Although sadly, RE4 falls short carrying on the RE Engine game's most important legacy. The saddest cut this game sees, worse than any other, is the lack of the fabled bolt cutters. A cornerstone of key items in modern Resident Evil, the bolt cutters have appeared in every game starting with 7 to rid us of those ugly, smelly bolts blocking our path. The bolt cutters sadly do not appear in RE4 and its absence will remain as a permanent stain on it as an RE Engine title. Jokes aside, I am getting pretty sick of every modern Resident Evil game's painfully generic, uninspired UI design. Resident Evil for the longest time took pleasure in theming its UI in creative and fun ways, and had a lot of purpose beyond just looking cool and interesting, because inventory and item management is one of Resident Evil's core design pillars, so giving the UI and inventory complex and thematic designs only further complemented and emphasized the importance of that gameplay pillar. You're going to be spending a lot of time in your inventory in virtually every Resident Evil game after all, so best have it be fun to look at and interact with. This UI downgrade has felt hard in the remakes of 2, 3, but especially now 4. The attaché case screen had so much theming and personality before, being rustic, mechanical, and rundown, reflecting the environments you trudge through. All of that is completely absent in the remake in favor of this boring minimalist crap. And I just have to ask, why? Is it just the modern thing to do for your UI to have as little presence and charm as possible? Come on. Let's finish off talking about the gameplay with the rest of the unlockable and extra content. In OG, you can unlock a gangster outfit for Leon that would come with secret little animations when reloading that let you swag on the enemies. And in the remake, it's been carried forward with even more of these little touches. The costumes extend to Ashley too, where her knight armor returns as well, still making her immune from taking damage or being carried away. But the remake goes one step further with this costume, through rescoring every cutscene she's in with clanking sound effects.
I'm hearing the president's orders. That went well.
RE4Make adds even more unlockable content than the main game this time around, through allowing you to equip a ton of wacky accessories, some of which having powerful gameplay effects, like the wolf tail increasing knife damage, antlers increasing melee damage, but most of all, fucking cat ears giving every weapon infinite ammo. All this added content is great for further fleshing out the replayability of what was already one of the most replayable games out there. Which then brings us to the Mercenaries. A mode that takes the game's addicting gameplay mechanics and puts it to use in a score-based horde rush mode, something that has become a staple of the action-forward Resident Evil titles. OG shaped the mode originally introduced in RE3 into what we know it as today, fighting off waves of the game's enemies and mini-bosses while collecting extra time and bonuses through familiar locations from the campaign, all about maintaining your combo kills of enemies for maximum score and rank. RE4 featured several selectable maps with their own roster of enemies, some even unique to this mode, and several playable characters with their own abilities and loadouts, making for an addicting game mode of mastering every map with all the different tools at each character's disposal. Sadly, RE4Make's Mercenaries is missing some content that will undoubtedly come with the Separate Ways DLC. Ada, Wesker, and the Waterworld map are absent. While I'm fine with Separate Ways being DLC, the missing Mercenaries content has been part of RE4 since the GameCube release, so that sucks. That said, Mercenaries in RE4Make does bring a lot new to the table, biggest of which adding Luis to the roster of characters, something I'm surprised OG didn't do, boasting his own unique melee attacks and loadout, as well as the ability to plant dynamite during Mayhem mode, a new mechanic. Every character fills their meter to unleash the mode, using their own powerful buffs to mow down as many mobs as you can before it runs out, adding another layer of depth to managing combo streaks. The maps too also have new unique elements you can take advantage of, like being able to use the cannon on the castle map or the turrets on the island. While the missing content sucks, the Mercenaries here is still great fun with nice additions that add more depth to your runs. Unfortunately, the Mercenaries patch also saw the release of a fucking microtransaction store, letting you buy upgrade tickets for the in-game weapons with real money, pay-to-win DLC for a single-player game. To the corporate executive dipshit who forced the devs to tack this clown shit onto an otherwise great game, this is why your mother doesn't love you. Something I've been adamant about with each of these remakes is how they handle the character designs. I've been very critical of RE2 and 3Make for its needless overhauls to the strong and iconic character designs of all the classic characters. This really is an area of remakes where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. For RE4Make though, considering thus far we've gone into how it benefits more from being a remix than an RE1 style remake, I'm happy to give it more room when it comes to doing something new with the character designs. And yet, just like so many other elements we've gone into, RE4Make still errs on the side of being faithful, despite having that extra room to change things up. The character designs in this remake seem to be following the philosophy the entire rest of the game does. The same thing at its core, but remixed or with extra spice added on top. Leon's iconic jacket and tactical getup returns, only now he sports the type of jacket seen in RE4's several pre-release concepts, which is really neat, with a more flushed blue shirt to be more reminiscent of his RE2 color scheme. Ashley is pretty much wearing the exact same outfit as OG, only with the addition of a jacket and leggings to fit in better with the cold weather. These additions and a tweak to her hairstyle notably make her look less like a Japanese schoolgirl and more like, well, Hillary Clinton, which fits, oddly. Luis too boasts almost the same getup, only his vest is now a full jacket, while still sporting the same design pattern. Krauser is nearly 1-to-1 with OG, Hunnigan is even more yas queen, Mendez now leans harder into his religious minister look, and Sadler now boasts creepy as all get out growths on the back of his head. Ugh. The only questionable redesigns here would be Salazar and Ada. I don't see the point of removing Salazar's hat, especially when the statue and all the figures still use his OG look. It made him look more boyish, which made for an uncomfortable, uncanny contrast with his pale, sickly complexion and white hair. For Ada, I can understand and get behind her having a more believable and fitting outfit for the setting, but they should have made more of an effort to incorporate the features and theming of her original Chinese dress in some way. Like, say, having a butterfly print on the thigh of her turtleneck dress, and having some form of those snazzy ribbon tails that blow in the wind. The two most prominent features of her OG dress. But overall, I'm very happy with how they've handled the character designs, keeping the same underlying design but adding to it or remixing certain elements, appropriate for the type of remake RE4 works best as. Which then brings us to how they've treated the characters themselves. This remake was gonna ride or die on how they handled Leon, and I'd say they did a pretty great job. Leon in OG was decidedly disconnected from his portrayal in Resident Evil 2, going along with the idea of RE4 being a fresh start, having transformed into an entirely different person in the 6 years since the incident. But not without good reason. His horrific experiences in Raccoon City and the years of special training shaped him into a hardened badass who uses humor to get through tough situations, but also knows when to be serious, what he needs to do to protect people and survive. They really leaned into making him starkly different from before, even making his hair pale blonde and giving him a stern demeanor with barely a hint of shine in his eyes. And I think it worked, his popularity as a character since speaking volumes in and of itself. However, RE4 Make takes great care in connecting Leon much more back to his roots, as depicted in RE2 Make, bolstered by Nick Apostolides returning to portray him. The story this time around devotes more attention to how he's changed since Raccoon City. In general, he's much more grim and distant, but surprisingly there are even more one-liners and wisecracks from him, most of which are even cornier this time around.
Nighty-night. Nights.
But where OG Leon did so whenever he wasn't taking a situation fully seriously, now Remake Leon seems to crack wise as a coping mechanism to counteract the horrors he faces. OG Leon's snark is more aloof.
Better try a new trick, cause that one's getting old.
Remake Leon's snark is more grimly fierce.
You're a shitty missionary. You know that.
There's a much bigger emphasis on the ways Raccoon City traumatized him, racked over the guilt of having to watch so many people die, promising to himself that he can make a bigger difference this time, leading to his conviction of protecting Ashley at all costs. This is explored even more when he comes up against Krauser, who in this remake is rewritten as his former mentor who taught him what he knows today. Battle and power is all Krauser can think about, and I see it as a dark reflection of what Leon could become were he to lose touch with his ideals. And so, their interactions really bring out more of that hopeful, idealistic side of him we saw in RE2 by contrast. And in fact, all of the characters challenge and bring out different parts of him like this, which really builds Leon into more of a three-dimensional character this time around. Luis shows how cold and jaded he's become, no longer so quick to trust people at their word. Salazar and Sadler bring out his snarky, ruthless attitude in response to malicious actors.
Tell someone who gives a shit.
Ada highlights the inner struggle between his heroic idealism and cold cynicism, and Ashley brings out Leon's desperation to protect anyone else from becoming a victim, like in Raccoon City. I appreciate this different take on RE4 Leon, and I find his more jaded outlook, but still heroic character to make a lot of sense coming off of RE2 Make. It's great stuff. Ashley too is given much more room to be explored. In OG, she was a very simple character, something of an eloquent brat, but with a gentle and caring side, making an earnest effort to keep things together through this horrible experience. RE4 Make reworks Ashley to come off as more mature as a young adult, as opposed to childlike and innocent, both in her character design and voice acting. She's a lot more well-rounded this time around, going from even more shaken, frail, and untrusting at the start, to showing how she's putting all her effort into being as strong as she can, being genuinely inspired by Leon's actions. She's given more room to be vulnerable, doubting herself if she has the strength to get through this, while at the same time showing her resolve to stay strong, in playing off of Leon's witty banter.
Get back!
Her efforts to not just cope with the situation, but to rise above it and be helpful to Leon whenever she can, is something that makes her a lot more likable and endearing. There's also a lot more emphasis placed on the parasites, which gradually threaten to consume Leon and Ashley, their minds being invaded by Sadler throughout the game, and having a real gameplay impact in being stunned by the Red Robe Zealots, these black veins being visible on them during gameplay, and by the end the situation becoming more and more desperate, as Leon struggles to keep it together just to make it to Luis's lab. But to that end, I don't understand why they cut the scene of Leon losing control and attacking Ada. If anything, it was only something that would further bolster the pressing need to get those things out of their bodies. Which is a good segue to talk about Ada. There's been a lot of criticism of her portrayal in this game, mostly in regards to her new voice actress Lily Gao. When you have a publisher like Capcom who has such little respect for voice actors that they'll replace the entire cast if it means saving a couple bucks, jarring changes to the character voices is a given by this point. But that said, I'm gonna have to disagree with nearly everyone here and say I'm fine with her new voice. I even prefer it to her previous portrayal in RE2 Make. I can understand how it's jarring to go between two radically different sounding Adas between these two remakes, but really Lily Gao's portrayal is a lot closer to that of her original voice actress in RE2 and RE4, Sally Cahill.
There are some things in the world better off not knowing. This is one of them.
The deal was, we get you out of here when you deliver the amber. No amber, no protection, Luis.
Unlike RE2Make's voice actress, whose voice I feel wasn't deep and mysterious enough, her new actress is much closer to how I expect Ada to sound. I do agree that perhaps her voice direction could be improved with sounding less bored and disinterested, but overall I'm happy with it. When it comes to her character, I'm also pretty happy with it. They did a good job of showing the layers of conflicting feelings and chemistry between her and Leon, which is what makes their dynamic so interesting. Their first interaction showing that flirtatious, playful side between them, Ada testing Leon on how much he's improved, ending in him besting her in close combat. What I don't get though is why Leon isn't the least bit surprised Ada is still alive. In OG RE2, Leon saw Ada toss him the rocket launcher to finish off Mr. X, but in that scene in RE2Make, he has no idea where it came from. So come RE4Make, I don't understand why he still lacks any big reaction to her return. Throughout the game, we're also shown that frustration and resentment toward her Leon has built since her betrayal in Raccoon City, making for a lot of conflicting feelings of tension between the two, especially when they travel together to the island. She tells Leon he hasn't changed at all, even if he thinks he has, and I think this is actually a nice moment for Leon's character, where despite him growing distant and jaded, Ada can see deep down that he's still the idealist who pushes himself beyond the limit to protect people as best he can. Leon then cutting through the tension and genuinely trying to reach out to Ada. And it's this incredibly straightforward mindset Leon has always had, which I think has had a real effect on her, even if she doesn't want to admit it. To that end of building this invisible bond between the two, I feel it's a bit of a missed opportunity not to have any gameplay sections with them fighting alongside each other, like Luis has been given. But in a brand new post-credits scene, we're shown Ada interacting with Wesker, appearing for the first time in forever, the Plaga sample in her possession. And it's here where, in seeing Leon escape from the island, we see the impact he's had on her outlook, to the point where she can no longer stand to be complicit in Wesker's plans. It's these kinds of moments of the characters developing off one another where RE4Make's story is at its best, also shown with how Krauser has been handled. In OG, it was pretty confusing how Krauser showed up in the third act, having an implied history with Leon that we never go into. But I suspect Krauser was first created as the central antagonist for the island, and then his familiarity with Leon was thrown in to set him apart from Mendez and Salazar. However, this much greater focus on their history together, along with foreshadowing him in the intro and introducing him earlier, helps a lot to make his introduction feel more organic and natural. Krauser is yet another character who brings out a different dimension of Leon, egging him on to show no mercy, weaponizing his role as mentor of higher status, shown visually too in how he's always towering over him. While all these new dynamics between them is a definite improvement, Krauser I'd say is a downgrade in equal measure. The most obvious point being his voice. Unlike Ada, Krauser's new portrayal is something I take big issue with. OG Krauser had a voice which was menacing, tough, and collected all in equal parts.
You catch on quick, as expected. After all, you and I both know where we come from.
Here, though, his performance is incredibly one-note. The voice actor simply lacks the deep range to be a good fit for the character.
Enough play, rookie. You haven't changed a damn bit. What a disappointment.
And as a result, him trying to sound menacing and tough comes off as incredibly forced and try-hard. Most of Krauser's lines involving unhinged screaming like some scrub gamer kid.
I can't wait to see you ride!
In OG, he worked as a double agent conspiring with Wesker and Ada, feigning his allegiance to Sadler purely as a way of retrieving the Plaga sample, his ultimate goal being to revive Umbrella. All of that is completely cut out of the remake, which I just cannot make sense of. These cuts hurt not just his character, but the story at large as a result. Where before there were many more layers to his actions and motivations, and the many sides playing each other, which created interesting tension and story intrigue, here everything now feels extremely one note in comparison. And along with his overacted voice performance, all of this makes Krauser come off like a screeching idiotic man-child. Like, I don't know how in OG he thought reviving Umbrella would make the world a better place, but it makes a lot more sense for a disillusioned soldier in Krauser to fall into the arms of Wesker and his organization than it does for him to earnestly swear allegiance to some deranged cult in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. On the flip side, fortunately they did a much better job when it comes to their treatment of Luis. He's been given significantly more screen time, even accompanying you in many more gameplay sections, having more opportunities to show his and Leon's personalities clashing, creating endearing moments between the two.
Give us a push, Sancho.
Who are you calling Sancho?
were given the chance to explore his backstory and piece together what made him the man he is today. The village is now explicitly said to be the place he grew up, making the tragedy that befell there all the more personal to him. Luis has been reworked as an ex-Umbrella researcher, which gives him more depth and now feeling guilty in the world-threatening parasite he's helped cultivate. Now he's on the run, being left with nothing other than to do what he can, however small, to set things right, going out of his way to help Leon and Ashley suppress and remove the parasites they've been injected with. At the same time, still being very flawed and afraid of retribution, to the point of seeking protection from Wesker's organization in exchange for the Plaga sample. This added screen time and depth does wonders to make Luis a much more memorable and tragic character. That added depth and lore also extends to the Los Illuminados at large. There are many more files and notes you can find this time around that focus on exploring the characters' backstories and delving into the history of the village, castle, and island, which helps a lot to make these locations feel more three-dimensional and lived in. The history of the Las Plagas and how they've affected the people of the area for centuries is also fleshed out, building up how this place ended up in such a horrific state. When it comes to the rest of the big bads, Mendez is still good, mostly serving as a looming, intimidating force of the Village Act. He's given more dialogue now that conveys his earnest devotion to the Los Illuminados religion, which is fitting. Add to that, further fleshing out his history in the notes, he fills his role in the story nicely. The more overt villains in Salazar and Sadler, on the other hand, have been hit hard. What made these two so memorable in OG was their active presence throughout the story, appearing at several points to challenge the heroes, and their back and forth jabs with Leon over the radio. In the remake, Salazar still taunts Leon regularly over the castle's intercom system, but it's far too underutilized to adequately make up for the loss of radio calls. And that's a big deal because much of the characterization and some of the most iconic lines in OG came from those radio calls.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Say whatever you please. Die, you worm!
So without that, Salazar and Sadler lose a ton of personality and presence in the story. They do let you shoot Salazar's intercom to shut the tiny bastard up, a nice little nod to the cutscene of getting one up over him in OG. However, all Salazar does when you shoot the intercom is giggle for a second, then go silent. So this detail feels like an afterthought. Even in their direct interactions, their back and forth is so understated and stale.
Not to worry. We've prepared a special ritual for you.
You have been bestowed with lore, settlers.
You talk too much.
Failed! You vulgar, utterly uncivilized mongrel!
Only for Salazar to fall and angrily transform off-screen. I just don't see the benefit of sucking the personality out of scenes like this. Also, side tangent, but what's with this remake's insistence on referring to Salazar by his first name, Ramon? That just seems like a really random change. Sadler suffers even more than Salazar through a big lack of presence. All but a few of his confrontations with Leon are either removed or replaced with visions brought about by the parasite. They literally don't even directly interact until near the end of the game, so Sadler is given precisely zero opportunity to actually develop a personality. In OG, he went out of his way to appear in front of Leon and Ashley, so hammy and confident in his plan that every interaction he'd maniacally and calmly taunt and threaten them, all with a creepy smile on his face. He was so nonchalant and jovial that it made for some strangely charismatic and memorable banter between him and Leon.
Since you're here, why don't I introduce you to it? It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
He was so aloof and upfront about his intentions, making no effort to hide how much pleasure he was taking in controlling the minds of everyone around him. But he was cunning too. He knew right from the start Krauser was untrustworthy, and only after the sample, yet used him all the same, as he stood to gain everything from letting Krauser deliver the president's daughter right to him, only to discard him once he fulfilled his purpose. Creating a really interesting dynamic of these two villains intelligently working together, despite being fully aware of the other party's duplicity. In the remake, however, all of that charm, personality, and story depth is thrown out the window. Sadler is nigh but a cardboard cutout in RE4 Make that spews nothing but religious platitudes of precisely zero consequence to anything. You could replace all of his dialogue with white noise and nothing would change. There is some attempt to further explore his backstory in the notes you can find, and how his ancestors were once persecuted by the village and the Salazar family, being banished onto the island. But it has barely any active significance to anything Sadler actually says or does to the characters throughout the story. So overall, the story and characters of RE4 is half and half. On one hand, it does a beautiful job of exploring dimensions of the characters, their dynamics, and histories in a way OG never even tried to. On the other, the villains are mostly direct downgrades that suffer from a number of changes and cuts that serve no purpose other than to make them, and the plot points revolving around them, one note and flat. Last thing I want to talk about would, of course, be the soundtrack. This is a department RE2 failed in spectacularly, ditching OG's entire musical identity and plunging the majority of the game into awkward silence. RE3 though did a mostly banger job on this front, recreating tons of OG tracks and giving them a boost in bombast. And I'm happy to say RE4 does an overall really great job with its music. OG RE4 has nowhere near as memorable a soundtrack as every Resi game prior, but still has a selection of fondly remembered tracks like the Save theme, Sadler boss music, and Infiltration, to name a few. OG's music leaned much more toward ambient background noise and atmospheric sounds, even for a lot of the boss fights. Well, RE4 utterly blows the door wide open on the scale and personality of these tracks. RE4 is now packed to the brim with thrilling and memorable themes not present before, especially when it comes to boss fights, lending these moments a lot more weight and excitement, like the classic Resi games always did. The music this time around features much more memorable and clear melodies. Some of the best battle tracks from OG benefit most from this treatment, like the epic and perilous Krauser themes.
The way you're going, there won't be anything left to protect. You'd have known that once. That's why you're wrong. I didn't know again.
There's a much bigger variety of music on offer here as well. Where OG recycled combat music repeatedly, RE4 gives each and every moment its own musical identity, the cabin fight being the standout example. The steadily swelling intensity of the music sending shivers down my spine in combination with the chance of the hordes surrounding you. A lot of the more ambient noise tracks received a boost as well, the opening village fight theme being a frantic, unhinged banger that really adds to the whole ordeal. Unfortunately, there are some stinkers here and there. Some tracks receive the RE2 treatment of downgrading the original track's melodies or rhythm into washed out noise. The Save theme, Infiltration theme, and Island Combat tracks being the worst offenders. But overall, I'm very happy with their treatment of RE4's soundtrack, to the point where it's genuinely hard to swap back to OG. Although I wish you could enable the classic sound effects separate from the classic soundtrack. I much prefer the more recognizable and more creative sounds over the dull clicks every recent RE game UI has had. That said, the implementation of the classic UI sound effects into this game seems pretty half-assed. There's some OG sound effects missing, like confirm selection, set down an item in the case, pick up pesetas, etc., and incorrect sounds playing where they shouldn't as a result. Also, can we please stop hiding the classic Resident Evil title call behind the OG soundtrack swap? To put a bow on everything we've discussed, the time has come to see how RE4 places on my ranking scale, analyzing and comparing it to other games in the series, and how it handles Resident Evil's core gameplay pillars. That being, exploration value, combat complexity on Octane, inventory and item management, and decision making. For exploration value, the game has seen a much bigger emphasis in classic Resi fashion to backtracking and revisiting areas to complete new tasks like side quests or obtain items previously inaccessible, right down to the inclusion of small keys a la RE1 and 2. OG RE4, in spite of changing the means of progression entirely to be combat-centered, encouraged you to still take time in scouring every area for hidden goodies like ammo or treasure. And this much is still true in RE4 Make, perhaps even more so due to just how many of the returning locations have been expanded with new nooks and crannies. With a much greater emphasis of expanding hub-based level design, like expanding the lake and Castle Grand Hall into full-fledged non-linear maps, I think it's safe to say RE4 Make eclipses the original when it comes to this category, setting the bar high at a 5. For combat complexity and octane, every numbered entry in the series has gradually upped the ante when it came to the mechanical depth and intensity of combat, with OG RE4 setting the peak at the time. The entire game and its progression now revolving around engaging in combat to proceed and build up money. On one hand, RE4 Make slows the pace of combat by a lot, harkening closer to the survival horror pace of the classic games by making you work much harder to manage the oncoming crowds through initially weaker weapons and more resilient enemies. The added aggression of your foes and the greater scarcity of resources on top of that gives RE4 Make's combat a decidedly more difficult and tense gameplay loop, where you will more often scrape by the skin of your teeth. On the other hand, the combat systems of RE4 Make have seen a huge increase in mechanical complexity, largely thanks to the expanded role your knife plays. The addition of parrying and degradation opens up a whole new world of using knives for both defense and offense. Deflecting a foe's attack to open up a melee, turning the tide of a battle, sneaking through and assassinating key threats before engaging, sacrificing durability to escape an enemy's grab, and so on. RE4 Make's combat is slower paced, but also more complex, meaning it comes out to the same rank as OG. 4. For inventory and item management, this one is a big focus for RE4 Make. It shares the exact same mechanics of fitting all the weapons, ammo, healing items, etc. into a grid-based attaché case you'll be spending a lot of time with. Like said, RE4 Make challenges you more than OG when it comes to your supply of resources, ammo and healing being much more scarce and thus making the decision of how you use it even more important. But what seals the deal is the addition of the now staple gunpowder crafting system, asking you to directly judge what resources will help you most in a given situation, elevating this category 1 point higher than OG. 4. And lastly, decision making. OG ranked high here due to all colors of moment-to-moment combat-centric decisions spanning the entire game. Which of your wide assortment of weapons would best help you in the situation, how much you would melee a knife to preserve ammo, and how best to position yourself within the level to manage the crowds of enemies. All of this remains true in RE4 Make, bolstered with the added elements of all the useful defensive and offensive moves you can employ with your knife, what types of ammo you should craft, and the expanded treasure system, and how you sort gems for the highest value. There were several points in OG of explicit choices offered to the player, like the split path in the village and whether Leon or Ashley could perform a given action, and some of those explicit choices were removed, but RE4 Make also opens up much of its level design in big ways, giving you freedom in deciding where to explore. The decision making is enhanced even further through fleshing out every system revolving around the merchant beautifully. More weapons available, an entirely secondary shop of exclusive items, and the addition of attaché case skins and charms, everything providing a new slew of interesting decisions throughout your journey. So this element soars into the heavens to sit with the big shots. 5. God damn. Resident Evil 4 2023 is just incredible, isn't it? Easily a masterpiece and one of the best games to come out in recent memory. The original RE4 never needed a full-on remake, it already accomplished everything it set out to achieve, and the devs behind RE4 Make clearly know and respect this. So then the route they take from there is a stroke of genius, creating a more survival horror focused classic take on RE4, the best move I think they could have made. Rather than attempting to top nigh perfection, they instead create a remixed, fresh take on OG. And yet despite that, despite having that extra wiggle room to change things and do its own thing, RE4 Make still blows the remakes of RE2 and 3 out of the water when it comes to content retention, knowing what to recreate faithfully and what to remix. And that simply blows my mind. Where RE2 and 3 Make cut out entire core features the games were built around, several enemies, bosses, locations, character scenes, and even an entire soundtrack, RE4 Make is leagues ahead in comparison, instead cutting out encounters or areas, a few scenes, and only one boss. RE4 Make justifies its own existence by being a refreshing alternate take on a genre-defining classic, while simultaneously being a better remake than 2 and 3, when it didn't even need to be. It turned out better than I ever thought was possible. But then that brings us to the million-dollar question. Is it the best Resi remake yet? Does it top RE1 Remake? The answer to that is no. Far from it. The simple reason being, even if RE4 Make benefits from being a remix-style remake, there's still far too much substantial content missing from OG to reach the bar Remake set all the way back in 2002. Because at the end of the day, Remake already does everything I praised RE4 Make for, in expanding, improving, and adding to OG's content. The difference between the two being, you can literally count the substantial missing content from OG RE1 on one hand. The room foreshadowing the helipad, the exceedingly cheesy cutscene introducing the cast, a couple of the choice moments relating to Barry and Rebecca, and that's it. While there's something to be praised about the sheer degree of content RE4 Remake does retain, given its much larger production scale compared to RE1, Remake still sits at the top as the shining example of a nigh-perfect video game remake. With all that considered though, RE4 Remake is a good remake in its own right, that shows you can create something faithful through retaining pieces of the original game's identity, while also using those same pieces to create something new and fresh, be it from the sheer breadth of expansions and improvements, or from remixing elements to surprise returning players. But then that brings us to the billion-dollar question. Is RE4 Remake a better game than OG RE4? Honestly, I don't see the value in trying to answer that, because that's just not the type of remake it works best as. The devs of RE4 Remake clearly understood that RE4 still stands today as a fully realized, well-preserved package, that being the reason they took this remake in a more survival horror-focused remix direction. So it just goes to show that, while they both share the same core gameplay mechanics, story beats, and style of gameplay progression, at the end of the day, they're both amazing for their own distinct reasons. I'll go to OG RE4 for its arcade-style addicting combat loops of juggling crowds with lightning-quick pacing, of flying through expertly designed unique encounters, while I'll go to RE4 Remake for its slower-paced strategic combat and gameplay progression, complemented by a greater emphasis of survival horror design tropes. But either way, the fact that they were able to make one of the greatest games of all time, twice, speaks volumes on its own. With how well this game turned out, online discourse has shifted to speculating about a potential remake of Resident Evil 5, or even remaking Resident Evil 1 again, and to that I have to say no! Remaking RE4 was already pushing it. When we start speculating about remaking RE5 is when we seriously hit the point of diminishing returns. And talking about remaking RE1 again is like saying, fuck all the hard work the devs put into preserving and expanding on Resident Evil 1, no, we need another remake of that, because I can't comprehend a character that moves forward when you push forward. Instead of trying to rationalize remaking games that hold up to this day, be it through gameplay or graphical fidelity and presentation, how about we focus on, oh, I don't know, remaking Code Veronica, possibly the worst aged entry in the series next to OG RE1?
You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know.
It's just ridiculous we're even having this conversation when Code Veronica is sitting right there. While I agree with many other reviewers that beyond this point the remaking is going to get seriously out of hand, with how well they handled RE4, I strongly believe Code Veronica absolutely deserves the same level of care and attention, as soon as possible, before they call it quits. Despite its many flaws, Code Veronica holds an incredibly strong identity and place in the series. It capped off the entire Umbrella saga, brought closure to Claire's arc, and signaled the start of Kristen Wesker's long battle. By all means, it's just as much of a mainline entry as Resident Evil 2, 3, or 4, and deserves the chance to be made into the best version of itself. But all in all, despite my reservations at first, I'm very happy with the direction they chose for RE4 Remake. Thank you so much everyone for joining me on this insanely in-depth journey into what is now 2 of my favorite games of all time. Next up, we continue developing my Halo 2 Rebalanced mod, all about refining the weapon sandbox, fleshing out the game's potential through expanding the weapon roster and encounters, and restoring lost pieces of content. Head over to my Patreon if you're interested and want to support any future Resident Evil deep dives I may create. Thanks again to everybody, and I'll see you next time. Peace.